Here you can see that a typical gigawatt nuclear plant in the United States, the latest efforts is $12 billion to build that. And in Europe, it's 8 to 10 billion. And yet, in South Korea and China, Russia, that same plant would be $2,000. And the key in South Korea has been to build the same design repeatedly and bring down the costs over time. The same way you would do with any product that's very expensive, the first one off the assembly line, like an iPhone. The first iPhone off the assembly line, I think it cost $2 billion. And then, now we get it for $1,000 or whatever it costs. Costs have to come down, or the costs have come down in South Korea by building repeatedly on the same design. And this, better yet, would be in a future build out of nuclear power, the reactors could be built centrally, the way we do with ships or iPhones, in factories or shipyards, rather than on site, each one unique, like building a bridge or a railroad. There you go. This is the Hyundai shipyard in South Korea, one of the advanced shipyards. And at volume, cranking these out in large numbers with shipyard or factory methods, you could probably bring that South Korean price down by half. And then you'd have a gigawatt plant for $1 billion, not 12 billion like our last attempt to do it. And you could generate electricity at 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is cheaper than coal, cheaper than natural gas, cheaper than anything. And that's the game changer, because then that plant manager in Vietnam who's about to build a coal plant says, I'm not going to build that coal plant because I can do it cheaper with one of those newfangled nuclear reactors that they're cranking out off their assembly line and producing electricity for 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. All right, so that's kind of theory, but let's look at what's actually worked in practice. My co-author always likes to say, if you want to know how to do something, look up on YouTube and find some videos of somebody who's done it before, and he's got, how to make fluffy pancakes or something. So how do you decarbonize an electricity grid really fast? And we need proven solutions that we know can work, and they have some advantage over theories and models that we're not quite sure how they're going to work in practice. So this book looks at places like Sweden, France, and Ontario, Canada, being Toronto, that have already successfully decarbonized with nuclear power. To decarbonize the electricity supply, the world needs to cut emissions per kilowatt hour. There we go. By about 90%. So the amount of grams of carbon going into the atmosphere for each kilowatt hour of electricity you're producing, that's the metric here. And the world is at about 500 grams per kilowatt hour, and we need to drop it to about 50. And this map comes from a wonderful website called electricitymap.org, electricitymap.org. And you can look up in real time where your electricity is coming from, what California is generating in the way of emissions per kilowatt hour. It'll show you over the course of a day the sources used to generate the electricity, et cetera. And they've color-coded it conveniently enough. So the high carbon methods of making electricity, like coal, are very brown. That would be, for instance, Poland on the map. Okay, so Poland is brown. Australia, very brown. That's coal. That's at about 800 on this scale. And then you've got Germany and California. They're about 200. And they're coming and going, sort of lighter brown and darker brown. Every once in a while, they flash green on a really windy day in Germany, a really sunny day in California. But most of the time, they're brown because Germany's using coal and California natural gas when the renewables are not producing. And then you've got the green ones, steady green. And they fall into two categories. There are countries like Brazil, Norway, New Zealand, Washington State, if it's shown up, there it is, that are using hydroelectric power. They're lucky countries. They have plentiful hydro resources. They've built dams, and they're producing carbon-free electricity that way. The trouble is that's not a model that you can extend to the rest of the world. Most of the places that can build hydroelectricity have already done it. There is some new build going on. especially on the Mekong River, but it's having pretty bad environmental effects, damming up the whole Mekong River. And there was a dam burst there that killed a number of people recently. But that's the hydro countries. And then there's a second category, Sweden, France, and Ontario. Green, year in, year out, all weather, day and night, and those are the nuclear power countries. They've already hit the target. They're already below 50 grams. So already less than 10% of the world average. And they didn't do it by sacrificing poverty. Sweden didn't do it by sacrificing poverty. Its economy got a big boost from the plentiful, cheap electricity when they rolled out nuclear power a few decades ago. The CO2 emissions per capita went down by 50% just in a couple of decades. And meanwhile, the GDP per capita went up in that same time. I visited Sweden's largest nuclear plant at Ringhals, where they have 4 reactors by the ocean, and it's not a scary place, it's rather a nice place. It disrupts the environment so minimally that you would never know that it's enough electricity to power a whole city from that little plant. And most importantly, nuclear power can scale up very rapidly, which is exactly what we need now to solve climate change. When France decided to switch from fossil fuel to nuclear power, they took the fossil off the grid and replaced it with nuclear power, the whole country in just 15 years. 15 years, decarbonized, got rid of the fossil fuel. Meanwhile, Germany has talked the talk about decarbonizing a lot. It's had very aggressive goals. It's had political support across the board, something that few countries have, and lots of money and lots of technical expertise. They've had this Energiewende policy for the energy transition, which is supposed to green up Germany. But their carbon emissions have hardly changed. And that's the metric that matters. Not how much you talk about decarbonizing, not how many people you turn out into the street demanding action, not how many renewables you install, it's your carbon emissions that really matter. And they've barely decreased. And in fact, most of the cases of adding clean electricity quickly to the grid, these are the fastest ones at the left in the world, have been nuclear power, those blue bars. You have to go out a ways to get to Bulgaria, which relative to its GDP added solar and wind pretty fast. Not as fast as South Korea and Sweden did, though, relative to their GDP. Germany and Denmark, we've added at the right side of this graph. They're not even in this top 10, top 15, but we put them in for a point of reference. The bottom line, if you follow Germany's model of building out renewables relative to GDP, it would take a century and a half to decarbonize the world economy, the electric grid. But with France's model, you could do the same thing in 30 years. So 5 times faster with nuclear power than with renewables. And looking again at this measure on the vertical axis of grams of carbon per kilowatt hour, that's called carbon intensity of electricity generation, it's been flat. It's been flat since 1990 when we first started signing these treaties on climate change. And if we didn't add any new low carbon sources, it would rise because our existing low carbon sources would be a smaller amount of the mix as electricity demand goes up. If we followed Germany's energy transition model, the one we were just talking about, it would be flat. We wouldn't ever decarbonize. And if we just, part of that's not fair because Germany has been closing its nuclear plants while it's building renewables, and you only close your nuclear plants once, so let's ignore that and just look at the rate at which Germany is adding renewables. And if you just do that, then it's coming down. But it's coming down so slowly, we'll just never get to decarbonization in time. Far too slow for mid-century. And if we look at Germany's best 3-year period, which by the way is not the last 3 years, but some years before that, their best peak rate of adding clean energy, it still would only get halfway there by mid-century. But if you look at France's rate, we would get there by mid-century. And my Swedish co-author always likes to point out that with Sweden's model, you could do a little better than France. If we apply the same kind of projections to the United States, again normalized for GDP size, the green line would show the expansion of wind and solar combined take most of a century to get to zero. And at the peak US nuclear build rate, the rate that we used to build nuclear reactors before we stopped doing it, relative to GDP, if we just repeated that now, that would be the yellow line, and we would reach zero before 2050. And if we did the French rate, which is the red line, we would go much faster even than that. Now, the most important country in the world is China, because it has more carbon emissions than the US and the European Union combined. And China currently leads the world in the construction of new nuclear plants, but not nearly enough. I think they have between 15 and 20 under construction now. China could reduce the world's carbon emissions by more than 10%, the world's total by more than 10%, in less than 20 years, just by building nuclear power plants massively and displacing coal off of their grid, French style. They would need about 650 gigawatt reactors in 15 or 20 years to do that. And they know how to do that. They know how to keep the costs low. And they have built these AP1000 Westinghouse designed reactors. The same thing we're in the United States trying to build in Georgia. That's that $12 billion thing that we can't seem to get built, and it's still not finished. They just put 4 of those exact same reactor on the grid in the last year. So they can build them. They know how to do massive infrastructure projects. You should get them to build your California high-speed rail while we're at it. And then as China did this, building hundreds of reactors to displace coal, it would also create the designs and production methods to help the rest of the world do likewise. So with this kind of approach, we can solve humanity's greatest problem, starting in China and going on to the new generation design reactors that are being developed now in the United States. The US design reactors would be centrally built. This is a small modular reactor concept built in a factory and delivered by truck from NuScale, an Oregon company. They're working on that now. And my favorite is actually built in shipyards and floated to its destination. Most of the cities in the world are coastal, so build them in shipyards, float it out to the city where it's going. And while you're at it, put hundreds of them on the oceans to de-acidify the oceans and suck the carbon out of the ocean so that it'll pull it out of the air to replace. Ideally, we're going to need about 1,000 new nuclear reactors every year worldwide. That's a lot more than I have in the book because my thinking keeps evolving. I keep realizing we need more clean energy. 1,000 a year for 25 years, we could actually do all of those things that I said at the beginning of the talk. Sequestering from the atmosphere, giving air conditioners to India, all of that stuff. And to do that would be roughly equivalent of the world's jetliner industry. So the world makes about 2,000 jetliners a year. I'm talking about 1,000 nuclear reactors. A jetliner is a couple $100 million per. I'm talking about building these for $1 billion, maybe get it down to some hundreds of millions. So it's a little more than the capacity of the jetliners in the world, but not that much more. You produce them for a gigawatt at a gigawatt reactor for $1 billion or less, and you generate electricity for 2-3 cents a kilowatt hour. The total investment worldwide would be about $1 trillion a year. But that's not an expense, that's an investment. You get most of it back from selling the cheap electricity, displacing fossil fuels, and someone will actually make a lot of money doing that. So by gearing up quickly to build new reactors at that rate, if we can overcome our fear and our political inertia, we can actually create this bright future for the world and solve humanity's greatest problem. And I have more information in the book, and there's also a website at brightfuturebook.com. So let me take questions now. Thanks.
So Joshua, it would seem to me that job one would be to stop closing down the plants that we do have. Is there an effort that you see gaining momentum to keep some of those plants operating?
There's some effort that's gaining momentum to keep plants operating that are operating. Diablo Canyon is a good example of it, and we have one in Massachusetts, the Pilgrim plant, that's going to close this June. When it does, it will take out more clean electricity generation than all wind, solar, and hydroelectric ever built in the history of Massachusetts. So all the efforts that the environmentalists have made will be wiped away in one day when they take the power plant off the grid. So that's crazy. In another sense, I don't really care about all these reactors because there's not enough of them to matter. We need to be doing the new thing. We need to be forward-looking towards, I'm talking about building 25,000 reactors. So whether Diablo Canyon is there or not doesn't really matter. And if you think about the world of 2050, most of everything that's out there now will be gone. All the solar and wind will have aged out by then. Most of today's nuclear plants that were built in the 70s and 80s will be, if not aged out, near the end by then. All the fossil fuel, which is 2/3 of our generation, will by definition be gone if we've decarbonized. And you'll have a few hydropower plants still going and so forth. But basically, we're creating something new from scratch. And the backbone of it has to be nuclear power and it has to be produced en masse, as I've been talking about. I think that the hard part of it is you need a lot of capital up front. I'm talking about $1 trillion investment per year. And it's very hard in a deregulated market to get investors to put money in for something that's going to pay off for 60 to 80 years down the road. So in the places it's been successful, there usually is a strong government support for the program. And I think we're going to need that, sort of an Apollo project, bigger than that though. Manhattan Project, Apollo Project, the World War II kind of mobilization for all these climate things. But this would be a core piece of it, to where the government would provide capital, funnel resources, stimulate the innovation, and then turn it over to private companies to actually build the things. One is the idea of spreading nuclear material around in a dirty bomb and contaminating a city. It's a psychological weapon. The amount of radiation is actually not going to hurt people. It's just going to freak everybody out and disrupt everything, which would be very expensive. If I were a terrorist looking for material to do that with, I wouldn't go to a nuclear power plant. I'd probably go to a hospital or somewhere else that's using nuclear material because they'd be a softer target. And you don't need a lot of it because it's just going to create the psychological impact. You're not actually making enough to try to hurt people with radiation. And the radiation does disperse. And in general, nuclear power plants are not a good terrorist target. People imagine flying planes into them and stuff like that. You're laughing because the containment vessel is made out of concrete and the plane's made out of, this thin structure, and it would just disintegrate. They did studies of this after 9/11. So that's not the worry. And the idea that terrorists are going to get nuclear material, I didn't talk about proliferation, but I want to for a second right now. Terrorists getting nuclear material and making a bomb out of it's really fanciful. It's extremely difficult to do, takes a lot of money, a lot of people, and even if you could get the material, it wouldn't be in the form that you needed. A country could do it, but countries that have made nuclear weapons haven't done it from civilian power plants. North Korea doesn't even have civilian power plants, neither does Israel. Pakistan has them, but it has two separate programs, one for civilian power, one for making plutonium for bombs. It's more efficient that way. So that's not really the concern. And nuclear power around the world so far has not contributed to proliferation of nuclear weapons in any meaningful way. We have strong institutions, international systems, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. They go in and monitor all the nuclear industry sites, and they put in cameras and seals and keep track of everything. It's worked well so far. If you were to expand nuclear power the way I would like to, you'd need to strengthen those systems. And you do want to keep an eye on it. But so far, it's worked, yes. They usually license extensions 20 years at a time, and nobody knows how long that could go. But some of the old plants are still operating fine. They upgrade them just as you said. And that, so when I said like most of today's plants will be pretty old by then, like by 2050, most of those plants will be 80 years old. Now, would the 80-year-old plant still be upgradable and working, or would we have something better by then? I don't know exactly, but yeah, they can go for a long time. And a plant like Diablo Canyon, that's a perfectly good plant that could go for decades more into the future. So they don't age out in that sense. We had a whole national program to figure out what to do with the waste and decided on this Yucca Mountain facility, sunk some billions of dollars into building it, and then for political reasons, it got squelched. It's still sitting there. It may still reopen. It's a perfectly good solution. It's what Finland is doing with their waste. Bury it deep underground. Now, it's true, there are elements in that waste that have very long half-lives and will be radioactive for a long time, but compared to the industrial wastes that we just dump down wells every day, they have half-lives of forever. You know, mercury, lead, arsenic, cadmium, those are all toxic things that we just dump and they're there forever. So radioactive waste has the advantage that at least it gets less toxic over time. Finland is building the first actual functioning repository. They're constructing it now. And Finland did a study of what could go wrong if everything went wrong with this repository. The casks that we're putting the waste in are already cracked before we ever put them underground. You know, they're falling apart. The clay layer that's packed around them, that all magically dissipates. And 1,000 years from now, somebody lives their whole life on 1 square meter of ground, right above the waste, getting all their food and water from that. How much radiation would they get? And the answer was about the same amount as eating a bunch of bananas, which are slightly radioactive. So this idea that any amount of waste, anything that goes wrong with the waste is some great hazard, it isn't. We've dumped a lot of radioactive waste in the ocean. It dissipates in the ocean. It doesn't concentrate. And that's not a good way to handle it. We have better ways than that. We've got a lot of waste sitting out in the casks out behind plants. It's safe. We've never had an incident with it.
In the third test, a diesel locomotive crashed into a truck at 81 miles per hour. The stalled truck carried a 25-ton shipping cask. Cask deformation was minimal, and the ability of the cask to contain and shield its radioactive contents was not compromised.
The casks at San Onofre haven't hurt anyone. I don't know what else I can say. If you're going to compare nuclear power to fairy dust, that nothing ever goes wrong and it never hurts anyone, then you're never going to build any nuclear power. Then you're going to keep burning coal. That's exactly what we're doing. And I want to say to the young people, that's what our generation, my generation, back with my long hair and my beard, we set this in motion. We don't trust nuclear power. There's nothing to do with the waste. It's too dangerous. We don't like it. We confuse it with nuclear weapons. And we set the world on a course that you, young people, are going to live your lifetimes and your children in an uninhabitable world of hundreds of millions of people dying in droughts and floods and heat waves because we, considering ourselves environmentalists, thought it would be unnatural to use nuclear power. And you, young people, should be rethinking that and demanding a change from us oldsters. Okay. Thorium and molten salt, actually two different things, but they can go together. Thorium is a fuel that you can burn instead of uranium. It's not quite true. You actually blank it and turn it into something and then burn it and so forth. But let's just say it's an alternative nuclear fuel to uranium. And going back to Rickover, Admiral Rickover created the light water reactor, things that we're using mostly ever since. But Alvin Weinberger wanted to use thorium, and there's a whole book about it called Superfuel. Richard Martin. It's pretty interesting.
Joshua, thank you for a terrific,
So
terrific lecture.
miles and miles of nature's scenery, covered in solar panels as far as my eyes can see. From the ocean's edges to the plains to the mountain tops, wind turbines shoot up like weeds, choking Earth's garden plot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They take paradise, put up green energy, felling 5 million trees diminished Scotland's charm. But they couldn't let those trees steal wind from their wind farms. They cut down U.S. forests and pelletize the trees, ship them all the way to Europe and burn them for green energy. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They take paradise, cut it down for green energy. Wind turbines and solar thermal kill millions of bats and birds, kill endangered tortoises and endangered raptors. Hydropower destroys entire natural habitats, but it makes green energy, so what could be wrong with that? Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They must sacrifice nature for green energy. Millions of tons of toxic solar waste, unending resource mining, giant toxic tailing lakes, all while they claim they're making our energy clean. What can it mean when they say their energy is green? Big oil runs ads for wind and solar power because they're unreliable day to day and hour to hour. And that locks in lots of natural gas revenue, even though gas leaks are worse for the climate than CO2. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They take paradise, put up green energy, 'cause they all hitched a ride on the same big green taxi. If only we could get them to rethink nuclear energy.